Is everybody excited about Judges?
Yes.
Yeah, couldn't care less.
I'm excited because this is my first. Well, it's not my first because I've read through most of Jeremiah, but like better understanding of Old Testament history.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited about that.
Judges is an important book because it sets the tone for the rest of the New Testament from that point forward. First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles cover the same thing. All of it is detailing what happens after First and Second Samuel, which is where the judge system falls apart. Not because of any lack of planning from God, but because the Israelites reject God. So, to get an idea of how to understand what is in the book, what do we have to understand first?
What happens before it?
What happens before it? Okay, if I tell you, and then I took off running, and it was chasing me, and it was about to get me, what does that message depend entirely on?
What is it?
What that it is. And if I just start out a story like that, you aren't going to get the full meaning of what I'm telling you without knowing what happened prior to that. So if we start back in Genesis, like we should have been following along in the bulletin, we get an understanding of where the origin of man came from, where Israel came from, how they ended up in Egypt, and it sets the stage for the Exodus account. The Exodus account sets the stage for the wandering in the wilderness. The wandering in the wilderness is what takes place prior to the conquest of Canaan, and once Canaan has been conquered, the judge system is set in place. So for us to understand Judges, we really need to understand everything that happened before it. So I'm going to assume you understand Genesis because we've been doing that detailed walkthrough in the bulletin for an entire year. But let's turn to Joshua 24. All right, real quick, we're going to take a look. All right, patriarchal age. Who is the leader? Why does that L have a whoop-de-doo on it? Who's the leader under the patriarchal age?
Moses?
Nope. Moses was technically a leader in the patriarchal age, but he ushered in the Mosaic age.
God.
Well, God is the ultimate leader. But in a local sense, who was the leader? Go back to Adam. All the way back to Adam. Adam was the first patriarch. You're skipping ahead. Let's go all the way back to Adam. No. Did you said Abraham? Let's go to Abraham, okay? Who was in charge of the leadership of Abraham and his family?
King.
Do you ever see Abraham give homage to a king?
No.
He gives an offering in Genesis 17, I believe, to Melchizedek, but he's not under Melchizedek's rule that we know of. Think back to Abraham. Who is in charge of Abraham and his family? What age were they living in?
Patriarch.
The patriarchal age. What is a patriarch? If you don't understand what a patriarch is, it doesn't make sense whenever you talk about the patriarchal age.
Abraham was in charge?
What was Abraham?
The head of the family.
Which is a patriarch. Alright, so in the patriarchal age, the patriarchs were the head of themselves and their family. They were the leaders. If you look back to Noah, Noah was the leader of his family because he was the patriarch of his family. Abraham was the patriarch of his family. He was the leader. He was the one responsible for offering sacrifices for them. Whenever you go to the book of Job, Job was set in the patriarchal age, either pre-flood or post-flood. It doesn't matter. Job is the one offering sacrifices for his children and the rest of his family. So in the patriarchal age, you have the patriarchs as the leader. But then Genesis ends and Exodus begins. And along comes a guy named Moses. And God says, you are going to be my leader. You're going to be the people's leader that brings my people out of Egypt. You're going to be my spokesman and lead these people out for me. So, let's not call that. In the Exodus and the wandering, Moses is the leader. Moses is the chosen man of God that leads the people and does what God wants with them. Who was Moses' helper?
Aaron.
All right, Aaron was his brother that was his priest, but he had a helper that was not Aaron. We could throw Aaron in that category. You're not wrong there. But there was a special man that helped Moses through the entire thing.
The elders?
Nope. You know his name.
Moses.
It's he.
Hmm?
It's he.
Yeah.
Miriam was not that much help that we know of. What book are we sitting in? No. Joshua. We're sitting in the book of Joshua. Joshua was the helper for Moses. Okay, Joshua was there helping Moses the entire time, sitting at Moses' feet, helping him serve God as the leader. So after Moses dies, who does God appoint to be the leader? Joshua. Joshua becomes the leader. What does Joshua lead the Israelites through?
Conquesting Canaan.
Okay, there we go. The conquest of Canaan is led by Joshua. Why is that important?
Because he was one of the spies?
Well, that is something that is important. What is important about this time period? What is important about the conquest of Canaan?
They didn't take all they were supposed to?
Okay. Yeah. That's not why I want you to think it's important, but yeah, that is part of it. When did God promise this land to Abraham?
Patriarchal.
All the way back when Abraham was alive, right? All the way back in the patriarchal age, long before Jacob was born, long before they ended up in Egypt, long before Moses led the people out, God had promised this land of Canaan to Abraham's seed, to Abraham's descendants. Joshua is the leader that sees that come to fruition, that sees that promise of God come into effect. Joshua is the one that leads the fight against the people by the power of God, and they take over the land. After Joshua, who became the leaders of Israel?
The judges.
Judges. The judges were not what we technically think of as leaders. We say that there were 13 men, one brave woman, right? Is that right? Is it 14? Oh, the song's slipping in my head. I am so tired, guys. I'm not firing on all cylinders. 14. 14 men or 14 total? 14 men, one woman. There was more than 15 judges. That song bothers me a little bit. Like it's fantastic for learning the judges, but it throws a bad judge in there that was self-appointed, and it doesn't count Eli's sons. It doesn't count Samuel's sons, and that matters a great deal whenever we get to the end of Samuel's reign, and Israel goes over to the kings. Whenever they switch over and say, "We need a king." The reason they felt justified in saying that was because of Samuel's sons, who were judges, but they're not in the song. So whenever we look at the book of Judges, this is most likely a snippet of select judges that existed. Whenever we see Deborah in place, Deborah is not the reigning leader over the entire group of Israel and Judah. We see Deborah as a local judge, a local leader. And whenever you think of how vast this land was, you got Jerusalem here, and you got all these different people. The Philistines are still hanging out over here. You've got all these different groups. You've got East and West Manasseh. You've got these, and these, and these, and these. All right, that looks like a cluster of groups. We're going to pretend that's a to scale map of the conquest of Israel and the dividing of the tribes. There's not even enough circles. Okay. Let's say, for instance, Samson is the judge in this area. How many tribes does that leave?
9.
Right? If he's the judge that covers 3 tribes, there's still 9 tribes worth hiding out over here. Given the setup, without sub-judges underneath him, there's no way he could adequately rule this group of people. They functioned autonomously in their tribes for the most part. Whenever they needed to, they would band together, and then they would go fight people if their existence was threatened. But they pretty much stayed to themselves. Benjamin was down here, Judah was right here, Manasseh was straddling the river Jordan, and you would have Asher up in the northwest. But these tribes didn't function where they interacted as one giant kingdom. Asher pretty much stayed to itself up here. Judah hung out down here. Essentially, go ahead.
Sorry. So, if a judge rules like those 3 portions, are you saying that each like circle has their own like sub-judge, or are you saying that like other sub-judges ruled in the ones around it?
There weren't sub-judges. What I was trying to get across is how a king rules is he sets up governors over provinces, right?
Yeah.
That's not how the judges did it.
Okay.
They didn't have one king judge and then governor judges underneath them. Each location and each city within each tribe would have their own local judges.
Okay.
Whenever you go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, you see Lot sitting at the gate. That was an esteemed position. Whenever you walked into a town, the judges, the elders that judged, would sit by the gate in every single city. So you had local judges. These judges typically are more area-wide judges. But they're not, they're people that were important in judging matters of the law. And that was pretty much it.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
They're not like a king. We tend to think of rulers as either governors or commissioners or presidents. This is not like that at all. The judges really only came into a leadership position whenever it was needed to defend Israel. Does that make sense? Kind of?
Yeah.
Okay. So, whenever you have Asher up here and Judah down here, Asher and Judah aren't interacting every single day. Okay? It's a lot like allies. They existed as a nation, but they pretty much stayed to themselves within their own separate tribe states. Does that make sense? At times, you will see those tribes turn and fight on each other, even in Old Testament history. There's a point in time where Benjamin almost got wiped off the map by everybody else because of how far off the rails they went. They were raping and killing visitors to their cities. So everybody else got together and killed Benjamin with a slight few left over that they didn't kill just so Benjamin would stay in existence. They vowed that there would be no wives out of their tribes given to Benjamin. So then, to keep Benjamin in existence with the lineage, they kidnapped wives like that was better and brought them in. So there are times when the tribes turn and fight even with each other, even in the period of the judges. Does that make sense? It's like how California and Missouri would exist together if there was no national government overseeing everything. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. We each have our own governors. We each function on our own. We interact with each other as necessary. We might fight with each other at certain times if odds come up between us. But if China attacked, we would band together and fight.
Right.
Does that make sense? Okay. I know it's kind of confusing, but let's go to Joshua 24. We're never going to get there. All right, hold on. In the period of the judges, what I'm trying to get is the leaders or local judges. If you have a judge come up from Benjamin in this book, we're not going to see them leading Asher because they're more localized than that. That's what I was trying to get at. Really, really kind of boogered that delivery up. In Joshua 24, Joshua gets everybody together before he dies. All right, they've conquered Canaan, and now he's pulling the elders of the tribes all together, and he starts into, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river, led him through all the land of Canaan, and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac." So he's going back and he's doing a history recap of everything God has done for them. "And to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and afterward I brought you out." Notice how God is phrasing everything in this delivery to the people. Who gave Abraham his children?
God.
Or his specific child? God. Who gave Isaac his children?
God.
Who took them to the land of Egypt? Who brought them out of the land of Egypt? God did. He's saying, I did all of that. That's important. "Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come upon them and cover them, and your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. And you lived in the wilderness a long time." How long were they in the wilderness?
40 years.
40 years. What happened during that 40 years that was important? They didn't need 40 years to walk the distance between where they were and where they were headed. So what happened in that 40 years there?
A new generation came.
A new generation came. What happened to the old generation?
They died.
They died. Why did God force them to wait until the old generation died?
Because the other generation sinned.
The generation that died sinned. All right, they were constantly complaining and grumbling, and would not obey God. So God waited until they died out, and a generation that was raised up in the wilderness was ready to go conquer the land. This generation came up entirely dependent on God. All right, they were fed by Him. They were given water by Him. They were told where to go by Him. They were entirely dependent on God. And that translated over into a mostly successful conquest of Canaan. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and invited Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you, but I would not listen to Balaam. Indeed, he blessed you, so I delivered you out of his hand. So that happened during the wandering. All right, this is pre-conquest still. And you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho. How did they get over the Jordan?
The water's dried up.
Okay, the river was in flood stage. The water dried up. They walked through on dry ground, went back and got a stone memorial. We're going to talk about that this afternoon, really briefly. But through a miraculous process, they crossed the river Jordan. He doesn't even talk about the miracle there. He just says you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho. And the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and also, without looking, look at me, eyes on me, name the 7 tribes of the land of Canaan. Bonus points to anybody that gets this.
Jebusites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites,
You already said Jebusites.
Hittites.
They lived in Jerusalem, by the way.
Amorites,
Mm-hmm. Those are the big ones. That's the biggest tribe. The Hittites, the Girgashites. I always mess this up. And the Hivites. I always forget the Hivites. All right. Also, going back to verse 11. Also, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. All of those were technically Canaanites, but there were some specifically referred to as Canaanites. And I gave them into your hand. Those were the 7 main tribes that lived in the land of Canaan. And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you, the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. Can you imagine what it was like to be in the middle of a fight? All right, you're in armor, you got a bloody sword in your hand, and a big old honking leather and wood shield, and you're bashing and smashing and stabbing people to death, and God sends hornets after you. Like, you ever been stung by hornets? You ever been swarmed by wasps? Like, it doesn't matter what's happening. I jumped off of a moving forklift one time and had to jump back on it because there was a wasp nest that was in the forklift, and they started swarming me while I was on the lift.
Nope.
So I jumped off, and the forklift started to roll away, and I had to jump back on it, getting stung to get the forklift parked, and then jump off and run away. But I didn't care whenever I jumped off because I was getting swarmed, right? It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a battlefield, you get swarmed with hornets, you're going to start going, trying to fight the bugs, and you're going to either run away or get stabbed while you're fighting the bugs. That is the kind of stuff that God did that turned the tide of the battle in the Israelites' favor. If you go in and you look at the group of people that went into Canaan and the fortified positions that they overcame, it's impossible on their own, right? Jericho was an extreme stronghold, but God made the walls fall down flat. And they ran inside, and everybody in Jericho was depending on those walls for their defense. That is the kind of stuff that God did that turned the tide and allowed Israel to take over. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. I am trying to get grapevines going, and I'm planting a boatload of fruit trees this year, last year, and the next several years. It takes forever to see that stuff come to fruition. All right, it takes years and years and years to get fruit trees established where they are providing a good crop of fruit. It takes years and years to get grapevines trained to where they put on grapes every single year like you want them to. Imagine coming into a place and someone just handing it to you and saying, here it is. You didn't plant these fruit trees, you didn't plant this vineyard, you didn't build the home that you're living in, but it's yours. I'm just giving it to you. That is essentially what happened whenever Israel came into Canaan. They got cities that were already made, they got farmland that was already taken care of, already worked up, where they just had to tend it and maintain it. That is a dream come true, guys. Imagine someone handing you a place to live for the rest of your life and giving you the security that comes along with it, saying all you have to do is obey God and you will keep this indefinitely, forever. It is yours. Right? The older you get, the
Cry.
more that dream becomes something that you just wish you could get. That is what these people had. So whenever we go to the book of Judges, we see a period of time where the Israelites are living in this land that God has delivered to them. They're living in homes that they did not build, taking care of places that was not theirs originally. They were not theirs whenever they came into the land, and God gave them to them. What we see whenever we get to the period of Judges, though, is what they call the Judges cycle. Oh, what a mess in here. Who knows what the Judges cycle is?
Nope.
I do.
Alright, well hold on, I gotta clear my board. Oh, what a weak eraser. Maybe it's me. Alright. Alright, at the top of the circle, what typically is put there in the Judges cycle?
Israel disobeys.
Yeah. We're kind of shifting how I like to set up the circle, but yeah. Alright, Israel disobeys. What does God say is going to happen whenever they disobey while they're living in the land of Canaan? You go all through the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, especially Deuteronomy. God tells them, this is going to happen if you disobey me.
They got delivered into the kings.
Hmm?
They got delivered into the kings.
No. Not unless you're phrasing that in a really different way than what I'm after.
But they would take it away. Who would take away the land of Canaan?
Okay, it wasn't specifically taken away per se. It was, they were enslaved. They were put under oppression. So, who is the bad guy whenever Samson's on the scene? Bad guys. Whenever Samson rolls into town and becomes a judge and is packing off city gates and killing people and setting fields on fire with foxes, which is an amazing feat.
Parasites?
No. Whenever you go to the scene of David and Goliath, who are the bad guys?
The Philistines.
The Philistines. Who was the bad guys whenever Samson was in town? The Philistines. The Philistines were a local nation. I don't have room for a map. All right, here's the sea. Here's Jerusalem and Dead Sea and Sea of Galilee. This is not the scale. This was Israel and Judah over here for the most part. Over here are the Philistines. And there's other people down here. I can't remember who's here. And then the Amorites were around somewhere. Anyway, there were nations around Israel and Judah that would come in and oppress them. Whenever we find Gideon, who everybody knows as a judge, what is Gideon doing when we first see him? Bonus points if you know this. Gideon is threshing his grain in a wine press because he's hiding from the Philistines, because if they know he has grain, they're going to come take it away and he's going to starve. So Gideon, the man that everybody knows as the leader of that band of 300 that fought against huge numbers and overcame by the power of God, was hiding from the Philistines whenever we find him. So foreign oppressors would come in. They would stomp down local tribes, not necessarily the entire cluster of grapes, but they would come into the places they were local to and oppress those tribes And then what would happen at the other side of the judge's cycle?
Obedience.
And God would raise up a deliverer.
Then the deliverer dies.
Hmm?
The deliverer dies. And then they disobey.
Well, not always. Actually, Gideon goes off track and sets up sort of an idolatrous situation at the tail end of his life by setting up a golden ephod because they thought of him as more than a judge.
What's an ephod?
Like a religious cloak. I don't know how else to. A religious tunic.
Oh, okay.
Something they wore. So a deliverer would be raised up. They would be faithful to God during this time because they needed God pretty much. And after they were fat and happy for a while, they would go back to disobeying. And then they would be oppressed because God was punishing them for their disobedience. And then God would hear their pleas for help, raise up a deliverer. They would be faithful for a while, and then they would disobey when they were fat and happy after a while. And they go in this vicious cycle over and over and over
You'd think after
through
a while
the
that they
entire
would
book.
learn something.
You would think
Because
so.
in the first 4 chapters, I was reading that and I was like, guys, can you get it together for just a little bit?
You would think so. But
Why does God keep giving them judges?
because they keep crying out for help, and God
He's loving and forgiving.
is loving, forgiving, and patient with people when we would not be. Put it that way. All right, here we go. Judges chapter 2. Something happens in Judges chapter 2 that sets the stage for the rest of the book. Are the people faithful to Joshua? Or faithful to God when Joshua is alive?
Yes.
Absolutely. Leadership makes a world of difference. Joshua not only is faithful to God, he has very high standards and tells everyone else they need to be faithful to God. And that makes it easier for the people to actually be faithful to God. So whenever we go to chapter 2, we see verse 7, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. So we have not only people being faithful while Joshua is alive, but the people that served under Joshua and saw all those amazing things happen, the people were faithful during that time because those leaders on a local level remembered what God had done for them and reminded everybody else of it. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation were also gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. You know why this generation came up that didn't know what God had done for them?
Because the other generation stopped talking about what God had done for them.
Alright, we have a failure on multiple levels here. Alright, so we have an older generation that is faithful. We have a new generation that is not. What happened here?
They never told stories.
Okay. Let's rework that wording a little bit. You're right, but I want it worded a little bit
They
different.
didn't train the younger generation.
Ah, there we go. All right, up here we had a failure to train. Down here, what do we have?
Failure to ask.
Let's reword that a little bit.
Failure to listen.
Kind of.
I like those other words. Failure to seek, maybe.
But a lack of desire. Failure to seek fits in
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really well with that. We had a lack of desire. If this generation really, really wanted to know what God wanted them to do, they would have found out. Does that make sense? The information was there. This generation was failing to train them up, but if they really, really cared, they had the information there. They had access to it. They had access to the priesthood. They had access to the books that Moses had written. They had access to the records of what had happened during the lifetime of Joshua. They had access to it, and they just didn't care. Whenever you see the older generation failing to train them, we can see that translate into the world today as well. Right? We see this a lot more so with parents and their children. This is something that makes me want to cry whenever I think about it a whole lot. Because when you look out at the church today, you see a lot of parents failing to train up the next generation. And almost inevitably, whenever you do that, that next generation, that new generation, they don't have the desire. Sometimes they do. There are always exceptions to these rules. But a lot of times, the new generation just doesn't care. Their parents don't really care that much to train them in it. They don't care enough to obey God in raising up the next generation of their children in the church, so they just don't care. And so what happens is you have this disconnect where a new generation becomes disobedient. Now we have a different cycle today. If we are disobedient to God, the chances are in our culture we are not going to get pounded down by the Philistines and forced into slavery and paying a crazy tax on the foods that we raise. Right? Most people don't even raise their own food, so it's not like the Philistines are going to kick in the door and steal all the wheat in your barn. But what we do is we go through this cycle of disobedience to God, and then whenever bad things happen in our life as a result of the sin that we've committed, we run back to God. And if we're not careful, if we're not faithful the way that we should be, we'll go through this vicious cycle spiritually over and over and over, where we're faithful to God, but whenever the times are good and we're fat and happy, we don't think about God, don't care about God, we fall away. And then whenever repercussions happen, we'll run back to God, and He will accept us back, even though we would not necessarily accept us back if we were Him in that situation. And then we're faithful for a little while, and when we're fat and happy, we fall away. And then we go through this vicious cycle over and over and over, and it is painful to watch people live their lives that way. Because whenever they do, it is a roll of the dice on whether or not they're going to die in a faithful state, because they're so hit and miss. They're so inconsistent. But whenever we're called to be Christians, we're called to be consistent, because that's what Jesus was consistent, day in and day out. You do not want to go through this vicious cycle like the judges did, the people in the time of the judges, in our spiritual lives. Whenever we see Israel in the book of Judges, you just want to reach through the pages and slap them. But remember, the entire time, whenever you're wanting to just throttle the people that are disobeying God during this storyline, that there are times whenever you deserve to be slapped and throttled too because of the decisions you've made in your life. And that will give you a little bit more understanding of what these people have went through if you've ever been through this cycle yourself. If you've ever been that person that knew better, that didn't do what they should have, that can give you some common ground with these people, and you can feel for them. You can understand what they were going through during this entire storyline. Who's your favorite judge?
Ehud.
You just like Ehud because he stabbed a fat guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody else has to have a favorite judge. We're past done with our intro, so.
I like Ehud too, so.
Everybody likes Ehud. Anybody in here left-handed?
No.
Right, Ehud's like the champion of left-handed people. They're like, see, he was left-handed too. We have common ground. The story of Ehud's really disgusting. What I find interesting in the book of Judges is some of the characters that are raised up as judges. We see so many imperfections whenever it comes to Samson. We see a lot of imperfections whenever it comes to Gideon. The more detailed the storyline is, the more we see people tend to be human, if that makes sense. Even with Samuel, we know more about Samuel than any other judge. And I love Samuel so much because of the things he had to do and the time period that he lived in. The Samuel stank as a dad. Like, he had a fantastic reign, if you want to call it that, as a judge. But he failed miserably whenever it came to his sons. And because of that failure, that helped usher in the age of the kings and Israel's desire for kings. Eli, we know Eli, and we don't see a whole lot about Eli and his faithfulness to God, but we know that Eli had sons that were cheating people. Not just a little bit, completely ripping people off whenever they came to give an offering and forcing people to disobey God according to the law of Moses so they could get more meat to eat. Which is very, very interesting whenever you consider that Eli was very, very obese. So you make it wonder if he didn't set that stage for gluttony to happen with his sons. Very, very interesting to look at and consider. But the more we see these judges, the more we see their human side and how they weren't perfect. We can learn a lot of lessons from them. We are going to try to get through. Let's gun for 2 judges a week. And some will move faster, some will move slower, especially when we get to Samuel. But we're going to have to try to boogie through Samuel. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Good idea to read the tail end of Joshua into the first part of the book of Judges and get through those first several judges so you know who we're talking about before next week.